What's up, my Faith and Fit fam? Today we're continuing our discussion on the resurrection of Jesus. If you missed the last video, we talked about what the resurrection would have meant to a first century Jew living at that time, as well as how to look at the resurrection from an actual historical event and some historical tools and methods that you can use to do that. Today we're going to talk about, was Jesus dead on the cross? Was he crucified? Was he taken down from the cross and put into the tomb? And were there guards that actually guarding the tomb? By the way, guys, my name is Daniel Ray. Welcome to Faith and Fit. I'm a Christian, lived with an atheist for a year, no idea how to defend my faith, and I don't want you to be one of those Christians. Let's get into it. Now, was Jesus dead on the cross? One thing historians are sure of, if Jesus was indeed crucified, which both atheist and Christian historians alike agree that he probably was, that he was definitely dead. The process of being crucified originated with the Assyrians, and then the Babylonians, and then the Persians, and in the 4th century, Alexander the Great adopted the crucifixion and then brought it to the Mediterranean shores, where his successors would introduce it into Egypt, Syria, and then Carthage. And then it was during the Punic Wars that the Romans learned the technique and would begin to perfect the process. They literally had 5 centuries to perfect the process of crucifying, murdering individuals in the most horrendous way before they got to Jesus. They were essentially masters at murdering people. There's literally only one case where someone survived a crucifixion in 5 centuries. You have this guy, Josephus. He's a Jewish historian. He writes that when he was coming back from a certain village named Theoka, and then he came across 3 of his acquaintances hanging on a tree, or hanging on a cross, and then he begged Titus, who was the emperor at that time, to have them taken down, to which he would agree and indeed have them taken down, where 2 of the 3 would eventually pass away while in the physician's hands. So we literally only have one account where someone survived a crucifixion in 5 centuries. If Jesus was hung on that cross, he was definitely dead. Jesus being crucified, it's really not even that much of a debated topic. The general consensus by both Christian and atheist historians alike agree that Jesus was crucified, that he was killed on the cross by the Roman prefect Pilate on or around Passover in the manner Rome reserved for political insurrectionists. And all 4 Gospels have the accounts of the crucifixion, and then we also have 2 non-Christian sources that record Jesus' crucifixion, one being that Jewish historian that we just talked about, Josephus, and then we also have Tacitus, who was a Roman historian. And a lot about what we know about Rome during that time comes from those 2 historians. And then Sean also points out that it would have been unlikely for Christians to have invented the crucifixion by its founder, Jesus. One reason being the crucifixion carried with it an incredibly negative stigma. It was a death sentence that was reserved for the lowest of the low criminals. Think someone like Jeffrey Dahmer during that time, as well as Jews would have seen it as someone who was cursed by God. It's recorded in Deuteronomy chapter 21. And if a man have committed a sin worthy of death, and he be put to death, and thou hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but thou shalt in any wise bury him that day, for he that is hanged is accursed by God. Now, the crucifixion, the death on the cross by Jesus is not really that contested. The burial, however, is. So was Jesus taken down? Was he put into Joseph of Arimathea's tomb? So let's get into that. It's recorded in Matthew chapter 27, verse 59, how Jesus was buried. And when Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and then laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn out in the rock. And he rolled a great stone to the door of the sepulchre and departed. And so it's also recorded in Mark, Luke, and John. It's also recorded in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. For I delved unto you first of all that which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. And then in verse 4, in that he was buried and that he rose again the 3rd day according to the Scriptures. Now, the objection comes in with agnostic atheist scholar Bart Ehrman. He doubts the historicity of the claims that Jesus was taken down off the cross and put into the tomb. So one reason being is that even though 1 Corinthians is a pretty early text, it's dated to like AD 53 to 55. It fails to mention specifically Joseph of Arimathea, specifically Joseph's tomb, and specifics about the burial. So leading him to believe that there being a specific Joseph or an empty tomb was a fiction that was made up later on. He also notes that the Romans had a practice of not allowing someone who was crucified to not be buried. So providing even more evidence for his argument that Jesus wasn't buried, and that if he was, his followers would not have known where, leading him to believe that the discovery of the empty tomb was a fiction and had nothing to do with the rise of Christianity. In response to this, you have American scholar Craig Evans. So he says, even though Ehrman can point to documents where Romans did suppress Jewish burial procedures, this wasn't the common practice during peacetime. It's very important. So Rome did often allow Jewish people to observe their traditions as a way to keep the peace. And then we can also go back to that Jewish historian Josephus that we were just talking about. He confirms the law of Deuteronomy chapter 21, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but thou shalt in any wise bury him that day. So this would have been the law that the Jewish people would have abided by. And even when Rome governed Israel during the 1st century CE, Rome did permit the burial of executed criminals, including those executions by crucifixions. And Evans, however, does mention that Rome would prohibit the burial practices of the Jewish people during the rebellion of 66 to 70 CE. And then Craig Evans' argument is further strengthened with the discovery of Johannes. I'm not pronouncing that right, but we found his remains in 1968. You have these building contractors that were working in East Jerusalem, and they accidentally discovered this Jewish tomb with Johannes' remains, and he was found with a spike in his heel bone, and it's believed that he was a crucified victim, and that he was crucified during the 1st century AD 20, which was literally during the lifetime of Jesus and the lifetime of Pilate, proving that people who were crucified were eventually buried and put into a tomb. The response to there being a specific Joseph of Arimathea, Evans argues that Christians probably wouldn't have invented this specific Joseph of Arimathea guy. One reason being is that it's recorded that he was part of the Sanhedrin. Now, the Sanhedrin was the council that was responsible for indicting and eventually murdering Jesus. So it's unlikely that Christians would have made a hero out of the very individual that was responsible for crucifying Jesus, because he was part of the Sanhedrin. And it's also worth noting that just because Paul doesn't mention specifically Joseph in his writings, Sean argues that this is an argument from silence, and also notes that this makes a weak argument. Now, another debated topic is the guards. Were there guards that were guarding the tomb of Jesus? One reason being, if there were guards, then they would have been able to prevent the theft of Jesus' body by his followers. If there were no guards, then there would have been no one there to stop the followers from coming and getting Jesus and then saying that he rose again on the 3rd day. So it's recorded in Matthew chapter 27, verse 62, now the next day that followed the day of the preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees came together unto Pilate, saying, Sir, we remember that the deceiver said, while he was yet alive, after 3 days I will rise again. Command therefore that the sepulchre be made sure until the 3rd day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away, and say unto the people, He is risen from the dead, so the last error shall be worse than the first. Now, the first objection to this comes in, it says that this recording is only mentioned in Matthew. It's not mentioned in any other 3 Gospels, therefore it's not historical. And it is true that it's only mentioned in one of the 4 Gospels. However, it is mentioned in the Gospel of Peter, which is written around AD 150, and it's likely recording a tradition that is independent of Matthew, because there are no word similarities, making there 2 independent sources and therefore making it historical. Objection number 2, the guard story is completely made up, claiming that the author's writings was years after the event, which it was, and that would provide enough time to pass that this legend grew and found its way into Matthew's narrative. Answer this, Sean points to William Lane Craig, and the way William Lane Craig answered this is he takes us through a series of questions that likely would have been asked during that time. So Jesus rose. The initial claim is that Christians claim that Jesus is risen, to which the Jews responded, no, the disciples stole the body, to which the Christians responded with, but the guards at the tomb would have prevented such a theft, to which the Jews responded, the guards at the tomb fell asleep, and the Christians said, no, the Jews bribed the guards to say they fell asleep. Now, if there hadn't been any guards when the Christians claimed the guards would have prevented a theft, the Jews would have responded with, what guards are you talking about? But Sean argues that history tells us that's not what the Jews said, suggesting the guards were really historical, that the Jews knew about it, which is why they invented the absurd story about the guards having fallen asleep while the disciples took the body. And I did a little studying on these soldiers that would have guarded the tomb, and to say that they fell asleep is kind of absurd. It's a debated topic on whether or not it was Romans guarding the tomb or whether it was Jewish soldiers guarding the tomb. Either way, they would have been highly trained, but if it was Jewish soldiers guarding the tomb, they definitely wouldn't have been slouches. And so they were called temple guards, and they were responsible for protecting the courts and the gate of the temple. A unit consisted of 10 Levites, and there were 27 units or 270 men total on duty. And McDowell writes that if at night, if the captain approached a guard member who was asleep, he was beaten and burned with his own clothes. So there were severe repercussions for Jewish soldiers not following orders, which, going back to that argument, making it kind of absurd to say that they fell asleep. But anyway, guys, that is it for today. I hope you got some value out of it. If you have any questions, please comment down below. Look forward to seeing you guys next week. And